introduce them anyway. Okay, let's see. So first we have Professor Annelise Orleck, Professor of History at Dartmouth College and founding co-president of Dartmouth's AAUP chapter. Her books include Common Sense and a Little Fire, Women in Working Class Politics in the United States, Storming Caesar's Palace, How Black Mothers Fought Their Own War on Poverty, Rethinking American Women's Activism, The Soviet Jewish Americans, and We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, The Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Her writing has also appeared in The Guardian, Mother Jones, Jacobin, LA Review of Books, and The Conversation. We'll also hear from Sherene Seikaly, the Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and author of Men of Capital, Scarcity and Economy in Mandate Palestine. Her forthcoming book, which we're all anticipating, is titled From Baltimore to Beirut on the Question of Palestine. She is the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies, director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at UCSB, and co-editor of Jadaliyya. And finally, Barbara Weinstein, who is a Silver Professor of History at NYU and past president of the American Historical Association. She is the author of The Amazon Rubber Boom, 1850-1920, For Social Peace in Brazil, Industrialists and the Remaking of the Working Class in Sao Paulo, 1920-1964, and The Color of Modernity, Sao Paulo and the Making of Race and Nation in Brazil. During her term as president of the AHA, her monthly columns in Perspectives focused on the impediments to research and to academic freedom posed by what was then in 2007 the age of homeland security, including visa denials, document reclassifications, and initiatives to impose ideological balance. So we're here again. Okay, so let's just begin. We're going to have a conversation here, and I want to spend a little time just asking you what led to your decision to field candidates for AHA office by petition. You might begin with Annelise or Sherene, either one.
Sherene, do you want to start? Because I think you were involved before I was.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. When a resolution condemning Israel's scholasticide in Gaza, the destruction of every university, archive, and library was put before the AHA last year at the national meeting, the business meeting, which was unusually well attended, passed that resolution. I think there were about 600 people there, passed that resolution by more than 4-1. And we had thought that probably it would have been nice if it had been able to become a resolution under those circumstances, but we thought that at the very least, council would send it to the entire membership, which seemed fair for a vote. They did not do that. They tabled it, they vetoed it, and so the resolution died at that moment. And it was a real inflection point for this organization. There were a lot of conversations about the flagrantly undemocratic nature of that decision. I heard a lot of people discussing who gets to say anything about what the AHA does, what policies they follow going forward. A lot of alienation and many people talking about giving up their memberships in the organization. At this moment of rising fascism, and I would say galloping fascism at this point, a lot of people did not want to give up this organization. It's the oldest and largest organization of historians in the United States. As we'll talk about later, history itself is under attack. And so the affiliate groups, Historians for Peace and Democracy, Historians for Palestine, Palestine Historians Group, all got together and began to have discussions with people who might consider running for office. And that's where we stand now.
Oh, Sherene?
I'll just add, and Barbara was at the business meeting as well, so I'll give her a chance to add. I want to give a sense of how incredible the room was during the business meeting of this resolution. It was a packed room. There were more than 500 people there. There were people filed outside of the big hall, and we won the resolution by 82% of the people who were in membership. And I think one of the things that, two things that I think are takeaways of that win. One is that at that point, after 16 months of genocide, people had begun to understand that there was no more time for neutrality, that actually scholarly associations had the moral an institutional responsibility to stand up against the destruction of an entire educational sector in the Gaza Strip and Palestine. Second, I think one of the things that we felt very clearly in that room was the way that so many historians who are confronting conditions of precarity understood that taking the difficult positions, taking the principled positions, was actually the best way to imagine a better future for us all. And I think it's in that spirit, rather than ceding ground, it's really in the spirit of nurturing the institutions that we have and fortifying them for the battles ahead that we all came together.
It's a really great point. Barbara, do you want to add anything to this?
I just want to say quickly that uh, I had twice before this past meeting spoken on behalf of a resolution presented to the business meeting criticizing Israeli treatment of Palestinian scholars, denials of visas to allow them to study abroad, etc. And both resolutions were defeated at the business meeting, narrowly, but they were defeated. What I could tell is that what has been happening in Gaza had really transformed the response, and I was so impressed. I mean, I became president of the AHA in the meeting where there was the vote in 2007 condemning the invasion of Iraq. And that had then been sent by the council out to the whole membership, where it easily passed, but not by the same margin that happened with the Gaza resolution, the scholasticide resolution, which was passed by an even greater margin. And so I was completely prepared for the council to send the resolution out to the whole membership. I was absolutely unprepared for them to simply veto the resolution. So I just want to say that, this is not something I have just suddenly become involved in. It's something with a long history and something that I felt was really an unacceptable response. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's interesting how the veto of a petition with 82% of attendees supporting it feels unprecedented. So my question is, this mechanism that allow members to run by petition, is there any precedent for this, as a response? I mean, Barbara, you might want to.
Yeah, so I think that, I'll address that. So I think it's very important, given what some of our colleagues how they've responded to this initiative. It is very important to emphasize that nominating through petition is in the AHA bylaws. And so we are not doing anything that violates AHA bylaws, but it is permitted by AHA bylaws. I just want to mention, I'm currently chair of the Council of Delegates to the American Council of Learned Societies. So I know more than I ever wanted to know about the structure of learned societies. And many of them not only have this kind of nomination process in addition to the official process, but it's used more often. In the case of the AHA, it has been used very rarely because it's actually quite difficult to get the number of signatures of members that you need in order to nominate someone outside of the official nominating committee slate. So it is it is a completely legitimate way to nominate, and it also has an extremely interesting history because it originated with the events of 1969, when there was an attempt by AHA members to bring a resolution to the meeting condemning the war in Vietnam. And the resolution was narrowly defeated under very complicated circumstances, but there was also an effort to nominate Stoughton Lynd as an alternative candidate for the AHA presidency, which also was not successful. They were not able to get him even on the ballot. But what it was successful at doing is making the AHA leadership realize that the association needed to rethink itself. And that led to a number of reforms that expanded, made the association more democratic, maybe not as democratic as we'd like, but more democratic, and created the provision for nominating by petition.
Right. So you're saying learned societies do learn something at some
Yeah,
point.
absolutely, they do.
Okay. So let me ask if some of you, actually this is for all of you, can tell us more about your scholarly work, besides this brief bio, as well as your political and intellectual commitments as historians. And how does your work inform your candidacies? Anyone could begin.
Sure, I'm happy to start. My work throughout my career has been engaging with and examining social movements, poor people's movements, poor women's movements, labor, immigration, and as we have moved to try to get the AHA, as Barbara so eloquently put it, to think about how democratic it could be and needs to be. I feel like the voices of, for example, in my last book, looking at the most disfranchised workers, the lowest wage workers, people who often did not have and do not have legal immigration status in the various countries where they work, their willingness to put themselves on the line, to think about a fairer economy and how to achieve that, to get their voices heard. I really feel like I hear them in the background of this discussion, because so many people who I've spoken to during this period of the AHA election have talked about feeling alienated, feeling left out of the AHA, feeling like it's an organization that they could not reach to try to change. And all of the folks that I've worked on, I like to say that last book, it got me out of bed during the first Trump administration, and I think it will. It is doing so again. The example of these people who braved physical assault and violence to overcome or try to overcome the horrendous conditions in which they work. So, and my political commitments have followed along those lines. I've been very concerned with the conditions of adjunct faculty on campuses who don't have anywhere near the privilege that those of us on the tenure track do. And I think it's a moral responsibility to try to understand how to bring them more into the discussion. The AAUP chapter that we founded did some work on that, looking at the obviously the conditions of our neighbors, our immigrants, immigrant friends and neighbors all around us, who's are so much on the line right now. I think there are a lot of people in the AHA who are feeling that, but I think this is a moment when we need more voices, and that's partly what I think we were hoping to do when we had this conversation about what might professional associations look like in the midst of and in the aftermath of this rapid slide into authoritarianism.
Right. Yeah, full disclosure, We Are All Fast Food Workers Now is a book I've been teaching every single year. I made you so much money, 400 students.
All right, I'll
And
buy
it's
you dinner, Robin.
right. It's a brilliant book, I think, for our times. In other words, specifically for our times. I think students are still seeing that. And Sherene, whose work I also teach, I'd love to hear the relationship between your work your political commitments to your candidacy.
Thank you so much. I always start by saying that I am both a product of the Nakba, the ongoing catastrophe and denial of Palestinian peoplehood for the last century and political rights. I'm both a product of the Nakba and a scholar of the Nakba. And so both my parents became refugees in 1948, along with 750,000 other Palestinians who would become stateless. For me, history is a refuge. It's a place to imagine. It's a way to exit predetermined outcomes and what often feels like the grind of inevitability. And I've always believed that rigorous historical work entails killing our heroes. And I think I did that a little bit with my first book, because my first book was really trying to recover these men of capital or capitalists and women of thrift before 1948 who had been erased by both colonial and nationalist narratives. And I recovered them certainly on a certain level to follow Edward Said's injunction of historicizing a remembered presence, what he called a remembered presence. But I also wanted to critique them not just as objects to mourn, but subjects who built the infrastructure of our present. And 6 months after that book came out, I realized accidentally that I'd written a book about my own family. And so now I'm writing that book, which is a book about my great-grandparents and my great-grandfather in particular, who had a complicated life of multiple subject positions: a colonial official, a refugee, a slaveholder, a dispossessed Palestinian. So my hope is to, in doing that work, is to really always follow Audre Lorde's directive to really sit in the cold winds of self-scrutiny. And this is I believe, also fuels my political commitments, which is to organize within the spirit of accountability, to really foster productive discomfort with one another as we build and kind of nourish one another across difference. And I think that for me, the political and the scholarly have always been intertwined. And in that sense, I think in this particular moment, as we witness the complete annihilation of the Gaza Strip, and the official numbers now of 55,000 Palestinians, but we know that is a drastic undercount of the Palestinians that we have lost. For Palestinians globally, it's as if we have been at a funeral every single day. And that kind of interminable grief really makes history and storytelling urgent. It's a mode of survival. And so here, I think, we think of memory and narration and the study of the past as a way to understand our contemporary moment, as Ilham Khoury Makdisi has taught us, or as Hannah Sleiman has taught us, that telling history as a cautionary tale is a kind of historiographic form that captures the magnitude of our crises, but accounts for the past. And finally, I think telling our stories is a really a way of living despite catastrophe, of really perceiving the world and intervening in it, as Rosemary Sayed has also taught us.
Yeah,
And I would just say my political work has always kind of been about being in the university, but also well outside of it. And I think that at New York University, where I started my graduate training, one of the things that kind of taught me how to be in academia and continue doing the political work was the graduate student struggle, GSOC, and fighting from then for thinking capaciously about our precarity and thinking capaciously about the imperative of guarding higher education as a way to think about the future.
Yeah, no, we could all learn from your ethical commitments, just a way of being in the university. So Barbara, one thing I didn't mention in my bio is this amazing biography you're finishing on Frank Tannenbaum, who is, among many things, uh, an important figure in academia, in Latin American studies and race. So if you could talk a little bit about your own work and its relationship to your commitments to this to the AHA and what.
Yeah, okay. Well, I just want to say that alas, I am not finishing it. I'm working on it, but I'm not finishing it. I wish I were. Um, but I am very committed to getting this done soon. And let me just say as background, I feel like everything that Annelise and Sherene said, it's sort of the way I feel about doing history and the insignificance of history. And but I also, just to reference the short article I did for History News Network a month or two ago, in which I talked about I see myself as trying to be a disruptor in doing history, trying both to, I think, as many of us want to do, trying to uh, change, sort of give people a different way of seeing the past, of challenging the status quo, whether it be the intellectual status quo or the political status quo. I do want to be really clear that one of the things that makes me nervous when I'm doing history is when, when discussing history, is when everybody's saying this, more or less the same thing. And so that leaves me, even if it's something that I find politically appealing, it sort of prompts me to think, is there some other way that we could be thinking about this that would also be productive? And I'm always thinking about what the political implications are of the work I do. So I don't believe there is any such thing as scholarship that's apolitical. And I think it's especially important for me because I'm someone who studies a country, except for this latest project, country, my 3 published books are all on Brazil. That is, I have no originary connection to. I study a region that I have no organic connection to. And so I'm always thinking about, how is the work going to be received there? How is my identity as a US American going to impact the way in which people read my work? So I'm always thinking in terms of the sort of both scholarly and political implications of, whatever I do. And let me just say quickly about Tannenbaum, one of my goals in the book is not just to kind of engage in the classic declension narrative, because he goes from this kind of being a notorious anarchist in the 1910s, spending a year in prison, and then eventually becomes a kind of Cold War liberal, or kind of strange version of a Cold War liberal. And to try to figure out some way to talk about that, which isn't just the usual narrative of, as you get older, you get more and more conservative, which I hope has not been the case for me. So,
No, it has not been the case for you. And I
yeah.
know a lot of people like that who started out as anarchists and end up working in the Trump administration. Okay, so uh, let's speaking of U.S. Americans. So in the U.S., we're facing these twin crises of precarity and democracy, both at the national level, the state level, in some respects, the local level, but especially for our purposes in our own universities and colleges, professional societies, and whatnot. What is your vision for supporting the academic freedom, job security, and democratic inclusion of AHA members, especially those who are most vulnerable, and including adjunct faculty and others as well, people of color? Um, and this is for uh, both Annelise and Sherene, whoever wants to jump in.
I think that we're facing a series of interlocking crises, some of which are specific to history and some of which are facing higher ed and K-12 education more generally. And so, many of our members are K-12 teachers. I want to make the organization does have discounted membership for K-12 teachers, but it's my hope, and there's some representation of them on council and on committees, but it's my hope that we can make the organization even a more robust forum for K-12 teachers, many of whom have master's degrees. I was speaking to an activist among the teachers who said they consider themselves historians and they don't want to be, second-class members of the organization. I'm not saying that they have been, but I'd love to see the organization respond to the fact that they're on the front lines. In an era when, and we'll talk about the history wars in a bit, I guess, but in an era when 21 states have passed divisive concepts laws telling teachers what they can and cannot teach legally, and when their careers are on the line and they're facing, all kinds of violent responses, not, I think, from well-intentioned parents, but often from parents who've been mobilized in the service of very particular political agendas. I think, some way to build our community and have a series of conversations. I think the same is true for adjuncts. When I was hired, it was still 50% tenure track and 50% adjunct, meaning people who work on either contracts or a course-by-course basis. It's now 75% of teaching PhDs in the country. That has had ramifications for everything, including one of the other topics that are at the core of this campaign, this election, and this moment in American history, which is academic freedom. Obviously, people who have spoken out, against the genocide in Gaza and who have been supporting students in protests have lost their jobs, I think by the hundreds in many cities and by the thousands, I believe, across the country. So, and in general, people who are on contingent contracts have much less ability than those in tenured positions, particularly to speak out on behalf of their politics, their research. The new spate of institutional neutrality and institutional restraint policies that have been passed in the aftermath of the spring 2024 Gaza peace protests and the crackdown on our campuses have also really limited what adjuncts and contingent faculty are able to say without fear of losing their job, and non-tenured faculty. And obviously, we'll talk more, but, as Sherene has written in such a powerful essay, Palestine is everywhere. And indeed, what began as the Palestine exception to free speech is now the rule. And for people of color and for people whose work is in considered diversity, equity, and inclusion by the Trump administration, they're facing very, very tenuous positions on campuses. And I think given the state of this crisis and given the galloping nature of our descent into fascism and the structural changes in higher ed that have put us where we are, I think it's incumbent upon us to build on what the AHA has done well and to take it out a little farther into the spotlight in its willingness to fight and be involved even in controversial discussions, and particularly to stand for the most vulnerable in our profession.
I mean, you didn't mention it, but there's also the physical safety that you've experienced yourself from just trying to protect your students. And that's something that it feels, it's not entirely unprecedented, but it's really escalated in such a way. And the fact that this is an issue says something about our times. Sherene, uh, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I would say, Annelise just put it also powerfully. I guess I would say, of we'd like to make the AHA the best version of itself. And I think in these moments of globalized catastrophe, sometimes our instinct is to say the institutions are the problem. And the institutions are as good as the people who constitute them. And in constituting and strengthening the good work of so many people, like Barbara, like HPAD that has been around since 2003. Is that right? It came out first as Historians Against the War. Like the Good People of Historians for Palestine, like the Palestinian Historians Group, I think we envision higher education not as a gated community, but as a space of the commons. And I think in doing that, we are on the front lines of protecting ourselves from a rule of stupidity, from many forces who are intent on making us stupid. And any student of history knows that social movement, that the university and student organizing are core to social justice movement, to liberation movements, to, I say this to students in my big survey classes all the time when they're falling asleep. You might think that this is something to fall asleep at, but actually this is a space that you have to fight for, precisely because precisely because, as Barbara was saying, it threatens the status quo. If you look at the AHA Council's vetoing of the resolution and not sending it to the membership, it was because they didn't trust their own membership. Because the tides have turned and people understand that what is happening in Palestine is a microcosm for a global age of catastrophe. And I think in this moment, as we witness the final death of US exceptionalism, we have to understand that fighting for our universities and fighting for the possibility of higher education is crucial to continue to speak, to continue to write and produce critically engaged research, to understand that the spaces for critical inquiry are shrinking in this way. I think these are the only ways to, I mean, I think we have to see these struggles as intertwined. And I think, you know, within that, we have to also understand a global consolidation of the right wing. We have to also be thinking about climate catastrophe. I'm in Berlin right now. It's 95 degrees and it's 7:37. Like the entire continent, and they don't believe in air conditioning here. So, so, you know, and if you live in California, like Robin and I do, we don't have to teach our students about things don't always get better. They know that because they live in that reality, right? And I think in this moment, as we've seen so many of our universities, from Florida State to Columbia to University of North Texas to, and also many of our associations, the Modern Language Association, the HA Council's veto, I think they have, as so many have said, they've fallen prey to anticipatory obedience. And we cannot rush to comply in advance of the pressure to do so. The danger has arrived. It is here. And either we stand up and fight for our institutions and fight for the very you know, possibility of continuing higher education. This is actually what is at stake. At my own university, I have recruited 2 PhD students. I've already lost one of them, and I may not be able to keep the second because she can't get a visa appointment. And so I think that you know, I think this kind of closing of the ranks also means that the study of places like the Middle East and North Africa will exclude people from that part of the world, right? Perpetuating the very hierarchies that we're seeking to challenge. And for me, I think public universities are really at the front lines of guarding and shaping a different kind of future. And I think that we have to envision a mutual aid approach to higher education and to academic associations as well, right? To make these spaces, you know, places where we can build organically from the ground up, where we can invest in our human resources, and where we can, you know, offer spaces to produce critical, grounded, and innovative scholarship.
I'm so glad you put together two things that don't usually go together. That's, you know, anticipatory obedience and the need to actually save what's left of the university because there's so much pessimism right now. And I know I feel it. Some days I'm like I'm walking away. But the fact that professional organizations like the AHA can also play a role in trying to remake, not just preserve, but remake these institutions into what they can be. Thank you. Uh, I wanted to move to another question, and this is really for Barbara and Annelise, but Sherene, you can answer it as well. Uh, you know, we're dealing with all these material institutional crises, right? But we're also facing an ideological crisis, as you actually mentioned, Sherene, over who gets to tell the country's story, this country's story. What is the role of historians in the ongoing history wars, conservative attacks on the 1619 Project, critical race theory, and so on, in defending historical narratives and or counter narratives that highlight the place of racism, sexism, class struggle in this history? And in fact, I want to actually invite all of you to take this on. I want to begin with Barbara because, you know, even though part of the issue is about US history and Trump's Project 1776 and all this craziness. It's about global history as well, um, and something that I think we're all aware of. So, Barbara, do you want to jump in on this?
Well, first, want to say that obviously the role of the historian and the role of the AHA obviously are two different things. And the AHA is a membership organization. And so one of the things you have to sort of recognize if you're going to have an active and leadership role in the AHA is that you're talking about a diverse constituency. And so it's impossible to speak for, when talking about the role of the historian, it's impossible to speak for the role of the AHA, overall. And I do want to say just to put it in historical context that uh, because there have been various moments when people worried that the AHA some people worried that the AHA was being captured by people who now people on the right would describe as woke. And there was even a schism where a group of what I would call conservative historians or conventional historians broke away and tried to form their own organization, which really didn't go anywhere. So the AHA to some extent, reflects what the field of history looks like at a particular moment, and I just want to mention that for a long stretch of the AHA's history, a long period of its history, and a long period of the profession of history in the United States, the AHA's leadership consisted of people who, like William Dunning, who was president in 1913 and who was a leading apologist for Jim Crow. But even as recently as 1962, Carl Breidenbach was president of the AHA, somebody who was a flagrant anti-Semite. And so, the AHA's leadership has reflected at various times certain segments of the historical profession and not others. So, because while Dunning was writing, W.E.B. Du Bois was also writing. And so, but the AHA didn't necessarily reflect his position. So, and I do think today the AHA is more likely to reflect the concerns and the kind of let's say analytical frameworks that many historians are adopting, but at the same time, it's again a diverse membership, and I think there's always that concern: will certain people feel excluded, et cetera, et cetera. So the AHA is both, I think, at least regularly playing a very positive role in terms of um, uh, emphasizing the need for example, K through 12 teachers to be able to have more freedom in the classroom. And so there have been a number of ways in which the AHA has been, and when I was president, the AHA was very active in criticizing the government for denying visas to foreign scholars. It was very active in protesting reclassification of documentation in the National Archives, so on. So, I see the AHA as playing an important role at various moments in the profession. But I think, right now it's such a, I think that we're in a crisis. I think this is not just an inflection point, but a crisis. And I think that institutions tend not to respond well to crises, just by their very nature. And I think the AHA, as a very old institution with a lot of traditions, is having a difficult time figuring out how to respond to it. So I'm sorry, I'm answering about the AHA rather than about historians. But I think that our role now is to be as outspoken, and particularly those of us who have tenure, who are in a position of privilege, although it turns out even some people with tenure are getting fired. But those of us in a privileged position of having tenure, need to be, speaking out. And we don't necessarily have to agree on every point, but I think we need to agree that having the Trump administration make decisions about what gets taught in our classrooms is a disaster. And it is the first step toward fascism. So I think the role, there are things I don't like about the 1619 project, especially the fact that there's no mention of the enormous role of Brazil in the slave trade and the history of slavery. But at this particular moment, I will go to the wall to defend their right to put out the 1619 project. So I think we have to some extent, I think this is a moment where we might want to think about popular fronts and the need to figure out areas where we can ally and unite, and there are some issues. I think I think I would leave this for Sherene to talk about. I think at the same time, one of the dangers of the Popular Front is certain people who would be very eager to join them might nonetheless not have a position on Palestine that I think is a morally, acceptable one. So, it's a complicated time. And so I think we have to, give a lot of thought to what we're supporting and what we're criticizing in our public interactions. Even as in our scholarship, we have to be ready to kill our heroes, as Sherene put it. So,
Oh boy, Popular Front, no more traditions change shall bind it. You're sounding kind of woke there, Dr. Weinstein.
yeah.
Look, I'm woke. I slept 3 hours and I will always be woke. Okay, Annelise?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to pick up both on Barbara and Sherene's points. On Barbara's point about institutions being slow to respond to crises, and Sherene's on the dangers of premature capitulation. I think that the war on history, the history wars, have been going on for at least 30 years, maybe more. We need to look back to Lynn Cheney and the battle. You're the Gary Nash chair at UCLA, and Gary Nash was the one who led the assignment to write national history standards, which were rejected by Lynn Cheney because, as she said, there was not enough Robert E. Lee and Wright brothers and too much Harriet Tubman and discussion of the Klan. So, from the very beginning, there was this idea that, and she wrote a piece of the Wall Street Journal, The End of History. And it was all about, they weren't calling, people, historians like me, woke back then, but it's essentially the same argument. And they began to use the term revisionist history. And James McPherson, when he was president of the American Historical Association, I think in 2003, responded to that and said, revisionist history is part of the process. We each interpret, we disagree with each other, we find evidence, to expand what we believe to be representations of the truth, and then someone else comes along to overturn that. He said, for political ends, and this really begins with Newt Gingrich and the Contract with America, who painted him, he does have a PhD in history, but he left the academy back in 78. But he paints himself as someone who said, there was a better way to write history, and it was history that made people proud, right? And so I think we need to see the roots of that in the crisis that we're in now, because the change is that instead of someone in government criticizing it and the big scandal being I think Lynn Cheney ordered the pulping of like 350,000 guides to teaching history in schools because she didn't like a couple of the things that were said in there. That was the crisis, the scandal. Now we're at a point where it's literally against the law in 21 states, right, to teach history that is different, U.S. history that is different from what they deem acceptable. Indiana just passed an anti-Semitism law, right, which addresses any kind of criticism of Israel in the curriculum. And obviously, what just happened in Indiana a couple of days ago with the cancellation of hundreds of majors in all kinds of fields that people are debating over. I think all of this is something the AHA has to engage in. We can't just be, an organization that supports good work and gives prizes. And some of what the AHA has done around this has been fabulous. The study of curriculum and of how history has been taught in the 9 different regions of the country, really important. And all of the support that it gives to K-12 teachers is really important. But I think we have to strongly assert our right to teach what our research and reading says to us is true. And if we can't do that, and I think starting with saying we can't talk about Palestine, starting with saying we can't talk about what's happening in Gaza as genocide has now got us to the point where we're scrubbing the words women, gender, and sexuality from grants so that they're not canceled, right? And people are busily, taking down DEI sites. DEA is something else. But I think the battle has been brought to us. And I'd really like to see the AHA engage it.
Yeah, it's interesting because okay.
Sorry, can I weigh
Yes.
in just for a couple of points? I mean, I want to just, speaking of Lynn Cheney, like maybe it might be useful to remember that, Kamala Harris was campaigning alongside Lynn Cheney towards
Liz Cheney.
Oh, sorry, Liz Cheney.
Her
Yes.
daughter.
Sorry, yes. So, I mean, the Cheneys. So I guess I want to, I know this isn't what we're talking about, but the Mamdani win in New York, I think is relevant, right? We talked about this before, Barbara, in preparation, and the Mamdani primary win, right? The Democratic primary. And so I think there is a question here about wanting to challenge our establishment politics and wanting to challenge mainstream conventions. And I hear you, Barbara, that we, as we come into institutions and associations, we have to understand that these associations represent a larger group of interests and people. I think that taking the difficult principled positions is actually the only way to protect basic rights moving forward. And in the chat, you have Chelsea shared with everybody the genocide scholars who contested the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And I think you've found in this petition and the Not in Our Name petition, people who are from precisely a spectrum of ideologies. People who say, well, we have different positions on Israel or Zionism, and we're rejecting the weaponization of anti-Semitism to detain people, right? Like Mahmoud Khalil. And so I think we have to, I think that this is the moment actually to take the difficult positions. I think having moral clarity is a necessity at this time, because I think the shutting down of spaces, precisely as more people of color, working class people, international students, all these people are coming into, and challenging the system, it's not a coincidence, and it's been happening for a long time. I am down with everybody else about the Trump threat, but I think we have to also, constantly center the debilitating politics of disenfranchisement and austerity that we've all been subject to, that have led us to this moment. And I think, the final thing I would say is that I think many of us feel, that in the moment of the business meeting, and maybe in the last couple of years, for many of us, I think the AHA has felt like a very much US Europe space. And many of the, even in the American Historical Review and many other, it's been a long time coming to expand and globalize and bring different
Absolutely.
voices in. And I think the more that we can do that, the stronger we can be in these really dire times, where I think we have to actually really take the difficult positions, not the easy ones.
That's I think that's like the heart of the matter in many ways. And if we could just conclude before we get to Q&A, and just to build up on what you talked about, Sherene, and you may want to add more, um, whether or not any of you have additional concluding thoughts of precisely the kind of moral clarity and consistency that the AHA should offer in this moment. The Mamdani case is actually an excellent one that you can actually win. In fact, we should always win on principle, instead of pretending to, what the Democrats do, they move to the right. It never works. Like, it never works. But how do we make sense of this moment, especially when it involves a critical assessment of U.S. foreign policy? Um, so if any of you want to jump in, especially on this question of thoughts of the kind of moral clarity and consistency that the AHA should offer at this moment.
I mean, I guess I'll just jump in and really, Barbara mentioned it earlier, and so did Annelise, but I think we really have to center the Palestine exception and think about it maybe not as an exception, but as I have thought about it a lot lately, which is as a paradigm. So in a way, this kind of, you're racist for existing, basically. You are racist for narrating your history, is a kind of epistemological trap that subjects people to censorship, to detention, to losing livelihoods. And I think that this is a valuable space to think across our struggles, to think about Black liberation, to think about queer liberation, to think about immigration, to think about class politics, because I think that, the Trump administration, they've pretty much told us what they were going to do. We've known, right? And we've known that they have been, centering, silencing, and targeting universities and critical speech as part and parcel of their main kind of front lines of attack. And I think Project Esther is a really important site of understanding, how to escalate repression and silence any kind of critical speech, not just on Palestine. And I think here we are, again, witnessing the it's been this long cumulative duration of the erosion of academic freedom that we're seeing heightened at this time. And again, I think this requires, I thought back to the vote on the Iraq War, that Barbara led, and that vote, if I'm not mistaken, was 72% of
Not yes.
yeah. And the language, if you look at it, is not the scholasticide resolution that HPAD put forward last January was way less radical than that resolution. As Barbara has put it in a piece that she wrote, in the scholasticide resolution, it doesn't even mention it's very doesn't mention genocide, and it's very ambivalent about the question of intent, which only comes up in a quote, right? So, like, if the basic empirical fact that all of the universities, 80% of the schools, and every single archive has been destroyed by not just Israel, but a US backed Israel, right? It is a nodal point, and we cannot afford to be silent on this kind of moral political urgency and see that as the safe way to protect our discipline or our association.
Yeah,
I know we want to open it up to, questions. I just want to say very quickly that one of the things that distinguishes the American Historical Association from, for example, in my field, the Latin American Studies Association, is it's a place where people who work on Latin America or do transnational history can have can present their work to people who don't work on Latin America or who don't work on transnational history. And one of the features of the AHA over the last 30 years is that it has become somewhat more open to fields outside of Europe and the United States. But I think precisely because of that, there is a particular responsibility, I think, for the AHA to treat issues involving our colleagues and their students and educational institutions abroad, for that to be something that the AHA is concerned with and not just be concerned with, the situation within the US. And in fact, I think analytically it's impossible to separate them at this point. So I just want to reinforce what Sherene was saying.
Annelise, want to add?
yeah, and just very quickly, very quickly, to reinforce what all of us really have been saying. I was thinking about the forcing out of Kim Sajid at the National Portrait Gallery for being too enthusiastically in favor of DEI, in Trump's words, even though it was probably because she didn't like a painting of him and didn't want to put it in the gallery. And this, the resignation of the president of the University of Virginia, I think is just a reminder that, again, capitulation will not save us. I really believe that the people who tabled the scholasticide resolution thought that they were protecting the AHA. I do believe them when they say that, and there's many reasons for that. But because we write history, right? Because we research, we do stay true. It's our ethical, ground to stay true to what we believe from what our research has shown us. There's no way to hide, right? There's really no way to hide. There's no way to protect the organization from, the wrath of an administration that believes literally. I've been mockingly called the stand up and cheer historian, but they really want stand up and cheer history only, right? History that will, make people more patriotic and also that won't make white people uncomfortable, which literally is something that has been said. That's, the AHA can't do that and won't do that. And I don't believe even the most institutionalist people who have been running it would think that. So I think, the time has come to recognize that in this moment, we really have no choice. And I think this is what motivated many of us here and other candidates. I hope who I see here in the names, I hope will speak up in question and answer, to save this institution and put it to work for all the people who really need it. And we all need history that's done with some professional care and meticulousness, and not, history for the purpose of, of glorifying Donald Trump or anybody else.
Great. We have 3 questions. I'm just going to take them in order. The first one asks, if you and the other candidates nominated by petition win, what do you imagine to be the practical effects of the win? In other words, how would it be more than a moral win? Anyone wants to take that?
It's a lot of work. I don't know exactly what we would be able to get accomplished. I think Barbara has very wisely counseled, and I agree that one of the first things we need to do is really get a full accounting of a lot of the good work that the AHA has been doing, right? And to build on that. And then I think, make efforts to reach out. Definitely would like to see efforts to reach out to involve K to 12 teachers more. As I mentioned, contingent faculty more fully. I don't know how much, again, we can get done. Barbara knows better, having served as president of the AHA. But also the position of president is a moral position. It's a position where you write numerous columns and the big stirring speech at the end. So it's a chance to have a platform, and I would certainly make my greatest effort to get it out there. And also I want to say we haven't talked much about museum public historians, museum curators. I think these are folks who've been very, very much under fire. And the AHA has, incorporated those folks into the organization in the past. I think we need to renew that, see what they need. But the final thing I would say is that so many people, as I said, have said to me, I haven't belonged to the AHA for years, right? The AHA doesn't represent me. And I'd like to reach out to those folks in whatever way that I can to see what they would need from the AHA to feel that it represented them.
Anyone else want to add? So okay.
Sorry. Go ahead, Robin.
Oh, no, I was going to go to the second question, but go ahead.
I would just say, I worked a lot with the Middle East Studies Association, and I feel very much that approaching difficult questions with moral clarity, even if there's disagreement on them, of course there's disagreement on them, there's going to be disagreement. That's central to the work. But I also think that bringing different kinds of voices together, especially those who, might not have consensus on these matters, means also, more ideas about questions of adjunctification and precarity and graduate students, and how can we better support graduate students coming to the AHA? What does the AHA look like, at the meeting? How can we make it more inclusive? How can we change? How can we bring on, different kinds of panels? And that work has already been happening. A year, not this last year, but the year before, there was nothing on the program on Palestine, not one thing. This year there were 4 or 5 things, maybe 6, right? And that's just my little corner. But I think that practically what it means is getting more voices who, with a commitment to, like I said, this kind of mutual aid model.
Okay. Yeah, one of those panels, they put in a small room and we had so many people streaming out. The next question, I think the answer is self-evident, but it's actually worth asking the question. So many of us are motivated to vote because of Palestine, but most of us have colleagues who have other priorities. Given that, what are some other issues you anticipate fighting for in the council? What makes what makes what sets you apart from other candidates on these issues? I know some of this was raised in our conversation, but you may want to amplify that. Anyone, either one.
I think I've laid out a lot of different issues that I think are of tremendous concern. And I think, we stand on the precipice of many of the changes that have happened in the historical profession in terms of the incorporation of the histories of people of color, of queer people. That's actually some group that, that I haven't mentioned. But one of the there was a study that More Common Ground or something like that did of debates over how history should be taught. And they polled people across the political spectrum and across the United States. And one of the things they found is a difference in between Republicans and Democrats and how much they feel like other kinds of people's history should be incorporated into what's taught, what's learned. And I think what Sherene just said, we have to listen to many different kinds of voices because we need to write the story of many different kinds of voices, and because it remains an incredibly diverse nation. What was interesting about that study is at the end, when they raised those issues, even with people who were ideologically opposed to woke history or DEI allegedly, or critical race theory supposedly, even though they didn't necessarily understand what that is, they said, yeah, that makes sense, right? Everybody played a part, everybody contributed to American history, everybody gets to tell their story. So that's certainly something that I think the AHA needs to represent, as well as representing, as Barbara pointed out, these histories from many parts of the world. Speaking to Africanists, speaking to Latin Americanists, they were like, why would I join the AHA, right? The AHA has never been for me. And I imagine Middle Eastern historians have felt that as well. So I think all of those issues would be up for open discussion if we're elected to council.
Well, I think that both Sherene and Annelise talked a lot about precarity, and particularly adjunct and contract faculty. And so I think that I would expect them to be more focused on that issue than has generally been the case. This is a little bit of a sad story, but at the AHA meeting where I was presiding, whereas I went to they always have a cocktail for adjunct faculty, which, let me say, it has a reputation of being not a very happy event. And I went to that, and everyone there was amazed that the president of the AHA had come to the adjunct cocktail party. And I had just thought that was part of my, I didn't see it as something special. And so I think and now I'm pretty sure this is more common that president goes to, because it is such an enormous portion of our profession. But I still think a lot of people want to, who are in the leadership of learned societies, want to pretend that this isn't happening at the scale that it's happening. So.
Yeah. No, I think
I
that's
mean,
true.
I
One thing
think,
that is, go ahead,
oh,
Sherene.
no, sorry. You
No,
go.
it's okay. Just one quick thought that, you mentioned the graduate student organizing, and something that's uncharacteristically absent from what I've said today, but now I want to make up for that, is, that the campus labor movement has revived. Now, I think, some of the violence that you mentioned, Robin, and the crackdown on campuses is in part a response to the unionization of graduate students. But I think that, and undergrads as well, I think that that's the future. Like, I don't know that we're turning back, to a world where, 70% were of faculty were on the tenure track, or, a time before where we are now. But I think the AHA exploring and supporting unionization, which is the way for these, for the majority of our profession to get a fairer shake in the workplace, is something that I'd love to see as a priority of the AHA.
Sherene?
Yeah, I think one of the things too is to really emphasize, why history? Why does history matter? What is our relationship to the past? How is our relationship to the past speaking to urgently to the moment? I think these might seem like very deceptively simple questions, but they're at the heart of the erosion, again, of the very possibility of higher education. I mean, when universities say we're pausing graduate admissions next year, what does that concretely mean?
Right.
It means many things for many people. it means many things for undergraduates. It means many things for the kinds of classes we're going to be able to offer. When we have these blanket visa prohibitions, right, on international students, what is that campus going to look like without those international students? What are our programs going to look like without those international students? And so I think, again, as Annelise has said, and as Barbara has, really given us sort of, there are many things that the AHA has done. And I think we have to continue building on those things. And I think we cannot do that from a place of fear and a place of obedience. I think that the longer we stay in a space that capitulation is what will protect us, the more besieged we will become, and the less we will be able to protect the most vulnerable among us, which is a growing group of people.
That's a perfect segue to the next question, which is faculty layoffs have occurred more because of a decline in student interest in history tied to capitalism's never-ending upheavals than of issues of academic freedom. Do you think taking strong positions on issues of social justice could attract student interest in history and et cetera?
I totally do. I
Yeah,
totally
it was
do.
that's what did it for me.
Yeah. No, for me too. And my students are always saying things like that I take your classes because we want to see whose shoulders we stand on, right? We want to see what, who are the activists who've come before us? What are our responsibilities? What are their legacies? And I think that to the extent that historians do that, there's a surge in interest in history. And I think that this generation is more political than some of the earlier generations that I've taught, and they see history as giving them crucial context and skills. And so, yes, I think taking strong stands will matter in the same way you mentioned, Mamdani, in the same way that, his refusing to say, I'm not going to talk about, the genocide actually won him votes as opposed to losing them.
Anyone
And I
else?
also think, even though this moment is so difficult and so catastrophic, I'll keep saying, because I do think the catastrophe is a lens to which to think through. I also think we have to think about how social movements also move slowly through time in a historically cumulative manner. And I think the I mean, 3 years ago, the UC system had the largest academic labor strike. The graduate students led the largest academic labor strike in US history. There has not been a year on any of our campuses for the last several years where there hasn't been some kind of social movement upheaval. And I think that, teaching, and I think that the historical discipline allows us to envision that longue durée accumulation of lessons from social movements.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could use my moderator's prerogative just to also add to that question. Um, UCLA, one, most of, well, a good portion of the leadership, both in terms of the encampment movement, but also among graduate student labor leaders, come from the history department.
Yes.
And they are very, very prominent, and they connect their own research and knowledge or experience to the work that they're doing. And so for them, it's precisely, social movements in a connection to history that keeps them there, that makes them, really great scholars. The other interesting thing is that because of the repression on my campus, uh, we also have an overwhelming number of undergraduate history students who are being suspended, face expulsions. And we're writing letters all the time to try to stop this process. And the irony is that they're not mediocre students. They're our best students. They are
Yes.
our best students in history. They win the prizes for undergraduate theses. They're the ones who are there all the time in my office, reading deeply, and they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do: read, understand, act. And when they act, the consequences are the university will punish them. And so that's one of the dynamics that we also have to contend with. And what's beautiful too is that our graduate students in history who are leading labor struggles are also the ones mentoring and helping and building solidarity with those undergraduate students. It's a beautiful thing, and it's a model for what can happen in terms of even learned societies.
Can I just text something? I just wanted to say two things. One about the decline in enrollment, or not even so much enrollment, but in history majors. One of the things we found is that we are getting a larger and larger number of history minors. That is, people who are students whose parents basically want them to do computer science, but they really like history. And so they figure, okay, I can't major in history, but I'm going to minor in history. And I don't care if they major or minor, if they show up in history courses, I'm really pleased, though it may not have the impact of causing more hires. The other thing I wanted to just say quickly is when graduate students like Sherene were striking at NYU, even before I came to NYU, I heard people saying, oh, well, they're not really workers. Why are they? And people on the left saying they shouldn't be, unionizing and striking. Aside from the fact that I thought that was wrong in and of itself, one of the side effects of the unionization of the graduate students is that adjuncts now earn twice as much at NYU as they were making before the graduate students signed their contract, because graduate student teaching is classified as adjunct teaching in addition to fellowships. So all these people I know on the left saying, isn't it great that adjuncts are finally being paid better? But I said, yeah, but that's because the graduate students unionized and they really were the launching pad for better pay. It's still not what I would consider a living wage, but it's certainly better than what it was prior to this. And I think most people are not aware that on a lot of campuses, the graduate students organization has also led to better payment for adjuncts. So,
Yeah, I was there,
And
and
this is exactly what the government's afraid of. This is
yeah,
exactly what,
yeah, really, it'll get
people
out so
doing in
out of hand. Everybody will
1776.
be, earning something close to a living wage. Can't have
right.
that.
Right. And then we're training our students to be radicals. But in this moment, I think it's just good to think of, history as a very fertile resource from which all of these flowers bloom.
Right, right. No, speaking of killing our heroes, one of the things, I mean, I was at NYU when Sherene was there and when organizing was taking place. And some of the people who were very self-proclaimed leftists were at the forefront of trying to crush the union and redefining work as somehow education in order to not allow them to unionize. I'm just saying, because look at the history. So it
That
just
was
goes
a
back,
very
yeah.
formative time for me
Hmm.
to kill heroes, because it was like, oh, I see. Nothing like
Hmm.
labor struggle to actually reveal who people are. Um, yeah.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, these are really important lessons, I think, for the principle that I think we all are agreeing on, and a point that Sherene made is that, when we proceed and no matter what we do, uh, there's hardly anything more important than principle that, than basically standing and having moral clarity, ethical clarity, political clarity. And you can't and that means speaking truth to power, even if those in power are people who claim to speak for us and with us. They could be persuaded or they could be left behind. It just depends. Okay, so we are coming to a close. We're not quite closed yet, but we're waiting for, we have one more question, and then I'm going to say one thing, I'm going to say it again, and that is I want to remind everyone um, that July 15th, the end of July 15th is when the election period ends. And I want to encourage everyone to go out and vote. And I know I'm going to vote. I wasn't a member of AHA forever because it didn't represent me until this resolution came up, and I'm like, oh, I got to join. I'll give AHA all my money, and I'm definitely going to vote. So one other question before we go, and this is on behalf of Chelsea. How do we include graduate students more fully in the AHA through dues rates, et cetera? Question for anyone?
I think
I mean,
the
what we
AHA
did at
already has
Mesa was
discounted
to,
grad student and K-12 teacher.
Yeah. Yeah. And I hope everyone knows that when a faculty member registers for the meetings, they can register for graduate students on their registration for $15 each. So I have always, for the last 5 years or so, since they've been starting that, I've always had a cluster of graduate students who have sort of piggybacked onto my registration. And the department, it's so low, the money is so small that the department basically pays for the graduate students. So that's the registration. That's not membership, but I think the membership is also very discounted for graduate students. So just financially, I think the AHA has already been thinking a lot about that. But there are other issues besides the monetary issue.
Well, I
think
think the one you
also,
raised, Robin, is really crucial, which is that graduate students are forced to do all this free labor, in the name of quote unquote their education. So, but again, I don't think we can be speaking for them and have to figure out forums where graduate students really become, vibrant voices within the organization as it should be. And than we did. So I think they're the ones who come in and say, look, this is what we need. This is what I hope the AHA will do that regardless.
I would just say really quickly that, really having a commitment to graduate student leadership also of the association, to making that kind of a robust commitment. Because I think for me, to convince graduate students to come to AHA, it also has to be an expanding kind of space, especially for scholars of the Middle East and North Africa. And I think that's also about, creating space for leadership, creating space for really graduate student visions of their own future, because a lot of graduate students are basically told this is, you're never going to get a job, or it's not worth it, or this kind of like self-fulfilling fatalistic
Mhm.
Stuff that we ourselves as faculty have been fed for at least a decade.
Right.
And I think that there's a real danger to kind of falling prey to that. I think one of the things we could do at the AHA is really find ways around that, again, through a more mutual aid model.
Right. Anyone else want to add to that? Yeah. Okay, so we have 3 minutes and just wanted to do two things. One, to remind people that there are lots of links. It was sent to you in the general chat. And copy those links. Make sure if you're not a member of the AHA, please join. I was just joking about how much money, but it's really cheap compared to other things. People spend money on liquor, and AHA is much better. And if you are a current member of AHA, make sure there's another link to go to navigate to your ballot, and try to do it sooner than later so you don't forget. Um, uh, with that, I want to invite our panelists, if you have any last words, parting words, things that you think you want to leave us with as we move on to the next stage of our struggle.
Just that it's been a pleasure
Be
and an honor
brave.
to work with you guys. And Ahmed and Chelsea, I want to thank them. They're off
Oh,
screen,
yes.
but
Uh,
they
Yes,
did
thank
this.
you.
They organized this.
yeah,
Absolutely. Many thanks to all of you. It's an honor to be with you all.
absolutely.
Well, the honor is mine because I'm big fans of fan of all of yours for a long time. And I'm just, I don't vote for these things, but this year I can't wait to get my ballot and vote. And I hope everyone feels the same. So with that, we will close. Thank everyone for showing up. Remember to vote. This is a consequential election, and the AHA is an organization definitely worth uh, saving and being a part of and advancing. So, okay, I will see everybody.
Thank
Thanks.
you.